Atalofatu, it's Tim Tufuga. It's what is it? 5:15, January the 9th. So going live because didn't have enough storage on my phone, so I can't pre-record and put some stuff into it. But so I'll just talk live. I'm just going to talk about the Royal Commission that's just been announced by the Albanese government regarding the anti-Semitic shooting that occurred on December the 14th. I had once mentioned about the stabbing in Westfield Shopping Centre back in 2024, but I had stated that that too was an anti-Semitic event, but people disagreed, including the New South Wales Police Commissioner at the time. But I had some understanding of the narrative as to why the Westfield stabbings was considered and construed as an anti-Semitic event. From my national security analysis and studies over about 30 years of reading up on the subject matter, as a Samoan, I studied through my Masters of Police Intelligence and Counterterrorism, which I had some fallouts with some local people. But you get that. You can't help the racism in this country and the usual racial profiling. But as a Samoan, we're predominantly Christians, and we're not into this Islamic jihadism riffraff. But there's some people that are. So, admittedly, there are some Samoans who are radicalized, but that's not me. All right. Although the usual local Samoans and local police here in Queensland would suggest otherwise. To me, they're just Lokolianga and Aval out as a Samoan. Yeah. Yang o la o langa I New Zealand o whangau I Glasgow I New Zealand o la I le loku Assembly of God, loku pakipaki a ia mai Glasgow I Porirua, mako mai ngai le Kasiva Varukasi I Brisbane. So we've been here since 1981. Understood the culture shock that one has to endure as a first generation migrant, and the implications of the anti-Semitic jihadism and the murders of 15 or 14 people, and including the shooter, Sajid Akram, has reverberations to Polynesians and Pacific Islanders such as ourselves and all Polynesian people throughout the world, because we're dark-skinned, we're brown, and we are tarred by the same brush as dark-skinned people. And that includes people walking up to my house and saying that I look like an Indian because of my beard. And I say, mate, I'm Samoan. But you can't help racial profiling, and that's just the way it is. Now, white people, I can't tell the difference between a Russian and a Ukrainian. And I can't tell the difference between an Irishman and an Englishman. But can you tell the difference between a Samoan and a Tongan? You probably can't. But the point is this. You racial profile people, and you shouldn't be prejudiced. You should give some leeways as to the people you're encountering out in the streets. And in the saying of that, the situation here in Australia, I've lived here for 45 years and born and bred in New Zealand, came here in 1981. Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister in Australia at the time. New Zealand's Prime Minister when I left New Zealand was Robert Muldoon. Piggy Muldoon was getting rid of all us Samoans because they said that we were overstaying our welcome in New Zealand. That was back in the 70s and the 80s, so we came to Australia as, even though we were Kiwi-born Samoans, but every Maori that I knew in New Zealand told me to piss off from New Zealand. And I said, yeah, sure, fair enough. We're here in Australia. Anyway, Meanwhile, in Australia, I had to put up with my own little shenanigans with local Australian xenophobia. But you get that wherever you go. So I've travelled extensively and realised that everywhere you go, you always be prejudged. Even when I went to Samoa and lived amongst the Samoans, I was looked down upon it because I'm a full-blooded Samoan. They'd say, "Yeah, we'll never live for us." Saying that I'm a Samoan, I'm full-blooded Samoan. I couldn't articulate well in Samoan, but that's just the way it is, because although I was born in New Zealand, my father was a scholarship student from Samoa. He was doing his accountancy degree in Christchurch at Canterbury University, whilst my mother was a migrant, a teenager who migrated to New Zealand during the time when Samoa just became independent in 1962. Samoa became an independent nation after it became independent from New Zealand, when New Zealand invaded Samoa in 1914. When New Zealand invaded Samoa in 1914, the Samoans was a German colony. And in 1961 and 1962, Samoa gained its independence from New Zealand. But you ask that you explain that to a Maori, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know that. They wouldn't care. But if you have people like myself, you have connections to that history. A lot of this generation in 2026 wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about. But you're not as old as us. We are a bit long in the tooth, and that's just the way we are. We have a long memory as well. Now, the Royal Commission, there are two commissions. Dennis Richardson is the former head of the ASIO and the Australian Intelligence Community. He will undoubtedly deal with the intellectual, the human intelligence aspects as to how this had transpired, probably in the recent Islamic State radicalism of these mostly first and second generation migrants of Islamics into this country. Although it must be added that the history of the Islamic culture here in Australia goes as far back as the Afghans and as far back as the Afghan camels that became part and parcel of the Australian landscape because of the camel herders came to Australia and helped discover all of the outback Australian townships, Cooper Beatty and all these areas in the central west of Australia through to the Simpson Desert, all had to go through with camel caravans. And who trained these camels? They were Afghans. So the Afghans brought with them their Islamism and their Islamic religion. So the Sunni Islamics, the Afghan people have been here for well over a century. In recent years, we've had the Afghanistan war with Operation Slipper, with all of our boys going up there kicking ass and killing a whole heap of ragheads, well, as they call Taliban. And they brought with them their co-conspirators or those who worked with them. They've come back to Australia and the United States and have tried to assimilate locally. And you get these type of people who've flip the lid and become green on blue wherever they go, because frankly they realize with all the culture shock and working in countries that they regard as harem or haram countries, countries that are Islamic enemies, Islamic that is written in the Quran as the enemy of the Quran. They will always consider haram countries as places where they can legitimately assert their Islamic jihadism, and that is in various scriptures of the Quran. The Quran, Surah 9, chapter 9, the Surah 9, verses 30, that targets all Jews and Christians as infidels, and you must make war with them. And that's in the Quran, Surah 9, verse 30. And then you've got the Quran, Surah 47 and verse 4, which states that you got to not only punish the enemy, you got to decapitate them. So that's why you get all these Muslims chopping heads all over the place. Now that's just it's in their Quran, and their belief in the make war with the enemy is actually written in their Quran. So I've even cited the relevant scriptures that state all this. Now, when you look at how the Royal Commission will transpire, because we have a Justice High Court Judge, Virginia Bell. Virginia Bell is a renowned, highly criticized by the Jews as being leftist in her views. She worked at Redfern as a volunteer lawyer during the period of time when Redfern was notorious for Aboriginal insurrections, as it were, against their invasions of Australia and their treaty claims, not treaty claims, their terra nullius arguments back in the day. But that's in the 90s. But in the 70s, it was always the victimizations of the lost generation. So in the 90s, became terra nullius with the Mabo issue. So she would have been in the heart of that issue. So her leftish leanings would make her susceptible to be pro-Palestinian in some regards. So she would be highly criticised by the Jewish community, the Zionists in particular. So Prime Minister Netanyahu would have some reservations as to the officials who are conducting the arbitration of the Australian Royal Commission on the Bondi Beach shootings. So in the meantime, for people like ourselves who are scholars or readers of national security and multiculturalism, these impinges on our way of life, the way we have to interact with our fellow Australians, because people would judge us not by our religion but by the color of our skin. So we walk down the street and they say, "Look, mate, you look like one of them." And when that happens, we have a problem. So, I deal with people who come up to my house and say, "Look, mate, you look like an Indian. Can you tell the difference between an Indian, a Hindu Indian, and a Pakistani Deobandi Sunni from Pakistan and from Islamabad?" No, you can't. So the point is that when you have, an Australian society that was predominantly a white Australia policy that influenced Australian policy and community attitudes since 1901, when they introduced the Immigration Restriction Act, which was passed by Samuel Griffith, then it was the previous Premier of Queensland back in the 1880s, and who then became the first Chief Justice of Australia. He introduced promulgated the repatriation of the Kanakas and the blackbirded South Sea Islanders back to Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, where they were blackbirded. And he believed in the benign intervention of the Australian government insofar as repatriating the Kanakas, which inadvertently led to the White Australia policy. So, whilst we enjoy the Griffith University, it's actually named after a man who actually introduced the White Australia policy in Australia. But that's another story. So in the meantime, Australia tends to have a gaslighting, misdirection view of their own history. For instance, when it comes to Australian history, this year in particular is quite unique. It's the 125th year of the Australian nation, and nobody even talks about it. 125 years ago, on January the 1st, 1901, Australia became a federation, or the unification of the states and the territories to form the Australian nation. And officially, Australia became a nation. Now, that happened on January the 1st, 1901, not January the 26th, that we celebrate every day and we call it Australia Day. That's a lot of crap. That is, in fact, the Australian Thanksgiving Day. So Australian Thanksgiving Day is January the 26th. The Americans call it Thanksgiving Day because it was the day when the Quakers or the Puritans had arrived in New England, and the first interactions between white Americans and European colonizers who had arrived in American Indian Territory, America. Now, that was, a period of time that they celebrate to this day, calling it Thanksgiving Day. Now, us Australians, we tend to don't know what that is. We think, what's Thanksgiving Day? Well, we don't have that. We have Australia Day. But Australia Day was when our first lot of convicts landed and disgorged themselves onto the Australia on Botany Bay in January the 26th, about a week before the La Perouse arrived. Now, you can thank the Samoans for La Perouse, because La Perouse was held up in American Samoa in a place called Asu Village in Kukuila, whereby 11 French explorers and sailors were killed by Samoans. So what did the Samoans do? The Samoans killed them. And that whilst they were burying the French sailors, they arrived on Botany Bay a week after Captain Arthur Phillips had landed and hoisted the Union Jack, declaring New South Wales as a colony of King George III. Now, Australia never existed in 1788, so you cannot call it Australia Day. It's New South Wales Day. So New South Wales was declared a British colony in 1788. Now, all these Aussies, all these drongos and these Australian bogans are walking around saying that Australia Day is January the 26th, 1788. If you remind them that Captain Arthur Phillips actually declared it New South Wales, that'll correct a few ignorant Australians. But Australians are ignorant. Australians are a real bunch of drongos. They don't even know the difference between what is Australian and what is Australia Day from what is New South Wales. But you get that. And so if you want to correct Australia, they'll get upset. And so you have this White Australia policy. It had transpired in 1901, at the same time when Australia became a nation. So White Australia policy came out in 1901. And then you have the 1 million Britons policy by Arthur Carwell after World War I, which was to people or perish Australia by Britons. Now, that's where the 10-pound palms arrived in boatloads onto Australia, with paying their fees of, £10 to become an Australian. They were given jobs. Houses were built for them. When they arrived in Australia in the late 1940s and early 50s. So all these houses all along here in Woodridge and all that was all built for the Palms, who were arriving, 1 million Britons arriving in boatloads, having to pay £10. Now, recently, we've had all these wars in the Middle East, bringing all of these Afghans and these Syrians coming over here, and Lebanese, as early as the 50s and the 60s. A lot of them worked down at the hydroelectric schemes down in the Snowy Mountain schemes. So they built the hydroelectric schemes down in Victoria and New South Wales. That has powered all the electricity and water supplies down in Victoria and New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. Now, as for us Samoans, we were more recent arrivals. Now, when the White Australia policy had ended officially with the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, that was introduced by Gough Whitlam. Gough Whitlam introduced the reconciliation with the Aborigines in 1972, and then his time its time policy was the reconciliation with the Aborigines, and then in 1993 he had the Native Titles Act of 1993 when Paul Keating came into power, and the High Court had passed the legislation. Now, in part, we may say that Justice and High Court Judge Bell may have some bearing and influence in that as a scholar at that time in the early 90s. I was at university. I was at University of Queensland at the time, and I was studying Aboriginal political ideas at the Mickey Building at the campus at University of Queensland. But that's a few years back now. Now that's well over 30 years ago. But anyway, nowadays we talk about the alleged actions of multiculturalism, the bad side of multiculturalism, which is that's just the way things are. So we go through our teething problems, growing pains, and each generation will have their own problems. The late 70s and early 80s, it was the Vietnamese boat people. In the 90s, it was the Maoris and Samoans and Tongans and Pacific Islanders and Kiwis. That was in the 90s. In early 2000, it was the Afghan boat people, the Hazaris, coming in sieves off the coast and being processed in Manus Island and Nauru and so forth. And now we've had that generation from Afghanistan and Syria. We've had these radicalized Islamists, and in the 2010s, you had these radicalized people like Sharif in West Sydney, who were Lebanese, the Lebos, who became Housos, joined gangs, biking gangs, and like the Mongols and all of these Arab gangs who dealt with illegal cigarettes and smuggling drugs throughout Queensland and New South Wales, and now they're having little gang wars, and now it's spilled over to Islamic jihadism. They're getting to the hardcore of their Islamism. So now for us, people who've lived here for over 40 years and seen the ebb and flow of various multicultural groups, the Sudanese in recent years, 10 years ago was the Sudanese machete gangs, and that's now still going through its teething problems in Melbourne. And you have these stages of racial tensions comes with multiculturalism. Now the Ukrainian Russian war has had its own little Europeanism, xenophobia, Nazism. There's been a advent rise of neo-Nazism throughout Australia as well. You can see it with the recent arrests of a lot of Nazi advocates throughout Sydney and New South Wales. In Queensland, there was a guy here recently in Caboolture who was a recent arrival from England, who's been deported by ASIO and the Australian Federal Police, who was showing a lot of misbehaviour with regards to his neo-Nazism and the symbolism of Nazi paraphernalia that included having axes and machetes and so forth, that he was trying to incite racial disharmony throughout the Australian community. Now, I myself have been subject to a fair bit of racial profiling by the Queensland Police and even amongst a lot of the locals. But you get that. You have to deal with all the crap that goes on in this country. Now, in the meantime, we are having a paradigm shift in terms of the global geopolitical shifts in attitudes of even our world leaders. The rise of BRICS and China, the militarism of China has presented a real threat to Australian national security, simply because of our white Australia attitudes, our racism that's becoming endemic in Australian society. Even though we have Chinatown for over 200 years, but Chinatown in Sydney, Chinatown in New Farm, it's always been here for year dot, and well, not really, but anyway, it's been here for a long while. Sunnybank has all their little China as well on the south side, but the attitudes of people towards multiculturalism still have its teething problems. We've had this teething problem since 1901 with the Immigration Restriction Act, and to this day we still can see as more things change, more things stay the same. So, in conclusion to this long-winded little windbag, it's my little g'day to 2026 and how we're going to see whether POTUS Trump is going to acquire Greenland after he's arrested Maduro and asserting his regime change, which he has successfully done very well. And he's showing off how you're meant to do a special military operation to the Russians, saying that if you had captured Zelensky, the Ukrainians would have changed their minds about the Donbass and Crimea. But anyway, you get that. So now they have to do it the hard way. Now there are 1 million people, lives and their deaths later, you're still carrying on with this war, which is the grieving process of the Ukrainians and NATO in an inadvertent loss to NATO and their losing face to the world, especially to the global south. The global south are looking at what has happened with the European Union and NATO as a ignominious humiliation and humiliation of Ukraine and the European Union and the old ancient regime of France, Germany, and Britain in the eyes of the world. They're all seeing them as what they are, trying to grab hold of their colonial past and their colonial conceit in an age in which they have no relevance. The reverberations are felt right here in the Pacific, where we're seeing the Samoan Pacific Islanders looking at what's going on in major great powers of Europe going head to head with each other, with against America. And Greenland is now a focal point of how the ancient rulers of the world since the colonial period facing off with the new world order, which is America challenging the old regime. And we can see that Denmark next week will be talking with Secretary of State Marcus Rubio in the Greenland purchase deal, which is like the American Louisiana purchase, which is to buy Greenland, as similar to Alaska, how the Russians sold Alaska to the Americans. So Alaska, the Alaska purchase and the Louisiana purchase, and now the Greenland purchase can be an amicable way of securing the North Arctic national security interests of America. It would be in the interest of Denmark anyway, because Denmark will have a largesse windfall from America, giving them what they need for their economic credit and development of their nation. But if they want to go the hard way, you want to go hardcore with America, well, if you're going to disagree with the Greenland purchase deal, it's going to end up pretty badly. But the issue of Iran itself, with the Americans after the Operation Midnight Hammer, has left an indelible reaction to the Iranian regime. So much so that they've had a 43% inflation since that bombing, and although they're trying to big note themselves against the Americans with the Ayatollah Khamenei's challenges to the Americans, the Iranian regime is suffering a fair bit of civil unrest with the Baluch Sunni nationalists, the separatists from southwest of Iran, who are currently getting up to mischief against the Shia Ayatollah Khamenei Caliphate regime, and also the Shah Pahlavi pro-monarchists, the Shah supporters are also stirring up Iran as well. So that impinges upon the Middle East détente with the Israelis enjoying the Iranian implosion, their domestic implosion. But that goes back to where we were talking about the Royal Commission on the Israeli-Palestinian question, with regards to the implications on the Islamic Ummah throughout the world, with their antipathies against the Zionists of Israel. Now, if we talk about what happened in Israel with the October the 7th Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Al-Aqsa flood Hamas operation, and how that impinges on how the Islamic State radicals have decided to shoot Jews here in Australia. It all goes back to how it all started, which is the Roman Empire creating the state of Palestine in 135 AD, when Hadrian punished the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, changing the name of Judea to Palestine, which is the legacy of Roman colonialism and Roman imperialism. Now, everybody has, just gaslighted that history part and focused only in the recent Balfour Declaration of 1917, when Arthur Balfour declared Palestine as a state for the future homeland for the Jewish people, not the Arab Islamics, but the Jewish people. So that was the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Now, the issue of the Jewish settlements that was settled there in Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which has a direct connection with Australia, because Australia and the Australian light mounted infantry had actually attacked Beersheba in 1917, defeating the Turks, or the Ottoman Turks, in Beersheba, liberating Palestine. So the Australians did that. The Australians got rid of the Islamics and allowed the British and Balfour to declare Palestine as the future state of the Israelis, the Jews. Now, that's Australia's linkage to world history and the history since the Crusades. But that's another long-winded dribble on my part. But now we're back to 2026 and the Royal Commission. It's going to be interesting to see how the Bell Royal Commission will end, and how the Australian intelligence community's paper trails will find all the radicalized local Aussie people, mostly Arabs or Lebanese and Syrians throughout Australia, that ASIO will be targeting as many people, including Pacific Islanders. We're going to be all part of this racial profiling, including myself, maybe. But, you get that. So we have to deal with it and roll with the punches. Yeah, love for me, so yeah,